Awesome. We are live, just making sure that everything is working correctly. Amazing. Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 1 of the ISJL virtual vacation. My name is Nora Katz. I'm the ISJL's Director of Heritage and Interpretation. We are so excited about this program and the opportunity to introduce you to nuanced and complicated, engaging and fun stories of the Jewish South. You might be familiar with the ISJL's Southern Jewish Heritage Tour program. I work with groups from across the country who travel to the South to learn about Jewish life and how the history of Jews in this region intersects with other Southern stories, including and especially civil rights history. So the goal of the virtual vacation is to introduce you to the big themes in Southern Jewish life and to connect you with the people, places, and ideas that you might encounter on a trip to the South. One of my favorite parts of my job is guiding our tour groups through the South. I get to introduce people to the folks who are doing amazing work to share the South's history, to the historic sites and museums that tell the story of this region, to the restaurants and bars where you can sample Southern food and drinks, and to the organizations working to advance social justice in our country. So I will be serving as your tour guide for the virtual vacation. I'm just as excited about this role. I'm going to be learning along with you, answering your questions, posing some of my own, and guiding your experiences of these places and people and stories. One important thing that I always tell the groups that I guide is that any place can be a place of learning and reflection, even the parking lot of this Express Lube in Selma, Alabama. I think here we're talking about President Lyndon Johnson saying "we shall overcome" on national television immediately after Bloody Sunday in 1965. Don't worry, that's a story we're going to get to later. But the other important thing that I always tell the groups I guide is that I want our time together to really be a conversation. So even though we're just seeing each other through a screen, as we are all seeing each other all the time now, every single virtual vacation session will be live streamed on Facebook, where we are right now. So you can interact with the video with comments and questions. We're going to have a Q&A during every presentation. You might be tuning in this morning because you received an email announcing this program. Every week, we'll send you an email giving you an introduction to the next session, as well as links and readings and activities related to what we're learning. And these follow-up emails are also a great way for you to share comments, questions, and ideas with us after the session. So if you want to receive those emails, please, please, please fill out the form that I'm linking in the comments. I'm going to do that right now, theoretically. We want to make sure that everyone who wants to can stay connected to the virtual vacation and find out about upcoming programs. And we really hope, again, that you will share this with friends and others who might be interested. If you're not a Facebook user, which I feel you on that, or if you want to share these videos with others, or if you want to watch them again at your leisure, every single virtual vacation session will be available on the ISJL website. And that's another link that I'm putting in the comments. We have a web page just for this program where you can find out what's coming up next and watch all of our past videos. And in addition to that, read all of our past emails. So if you haven't gotten our first email, the first one is up there on the website that you can read again at your leisure. So that's logistics out of the way. I'm so excited for this first session of the ISJL virtual vacation. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Josh Parshall, who is the ISJL Director of History. Josh has served in this role at the ISJL for the past 3 years. He earned a master's degree in folklore from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then he served for 3 years as the ISJL's oral historian. So he's been part of the ISJL family for a long time. He then went on to earn a PhD from UNC in American Studies, and his dissertation focused on the Arbiter Ring, or Workmen's Circle, which is a secular Yiddish and cultural and political organization in the South. Josh's current work at the ISJL focuses on doing original research about the history of Jewish life in the South, and he serves as editor of the ISJL's Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, which he's also going to tell you a bit more about this morning. So today he's going to give us a whistle-stop tour of the big themes and moments in the history of Jews in the South. And our goal is really to give you a stronger sense of this history and to provide context for future sessions of the virtual vacation. Before we start, I'll also add that if you have any questions or comments for Josh or I during the presentation, please be putting them in the comments on the Facebook live stream, because we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you think of something, put it on there. I'm keeping an eye on it, and we'll moderate that Q&A after Josh's presentation. So Josh, please take it away.
Great. Nora, I just realized I did not set myself a stopwatch. So if you could maybe chat me like a 10-minute,
sure, happy to do that.
5-minute, something like that.
Yep.
20 minutes is about where I think this will land. So
amazing.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Nora. It's really great to be here and help kick off this virtual vacation series. So today, what I want to do, as I think Nora mentioned, is to bring up a few big ideas about Southern Jewish history, just to give you some things to sort of hold on to and to ground you as you move forward with these conversations that you're going to be having with Nora. So today we'll be talking about 4 things. The first is sort of the long history of Jews in the South, thinking about some of the earliest Jewish settlements in what we now know as the South. The second thing is talking about Jews' historical role, particularly sort of the economic role of Jews and really Jewish men as peddlers, merchants, and then civic leaders. Of course, there are many more stories to be told about the lives of Jewish women in the South, the things that they've contributed, the ways that they've had their own relationships to the region. And I think that's something that we'll get to more. I do realize today's maybe a little light on that history. The third thing I'll be talking about is the rise and fall and rise of the Jewish South. So the beginnings of Jewish communities in the region, especially in some of our smaller towns, their upward trajectory through, say, the mid-20th century, their decline, but then more recently the rise of some very significant Jewish communities in some of our larger cities. And then the fourth thing we'll be talking about is why Southern Jewish history matters. So I'll take this very brief thumbnail history, talk a little bit about why it might be important in thinking about the South and thinking about US Jewish history and thinking about other topics. So I'm having Nora advance my slides for me. Slide, please. So Jewish life in the South really begins, or what we now know as the South, really begins with Jewish arrivals to Charlestown, South Carolina in the 1690s. These Jews came from England, and they came from English colonies in the Americas. And what this map is really meant to represent is the way that the South, as we know it today, was not the South yet. In the words of Dale and Ted Rosengarten, it was really the northern edge of the Gulf Caribbean plantation region. And so those Jews in Savannah and Charleston had relationships with Jews in, say, Philadelphia or New Amsterdam, but they also had close relationships in many cases with Jews in the sort of Atlantic coastal settlements to their south. The Jews in Savannah and Charleston were relatively accepted compared to counterparts in New England and in northern colonies. Much of New England basically didn't allow Jews to settle there. They had restricted rights in New Amsterdam, now New York. But in sort of these emerging southeastern colonies, they had more rights. So they were explicitly afforded rights in the original South Carolina Constitution, which was actually written by John Locke, the famous Enlightenment thinker. They were socially still somewhat less than white Christian counterparts, but they did at least have a base level of rights. Jews also in Savannah were among some of the early elected officials. Jews had been in Savannah since 1734, really at the beginning of the colony. And in the early Republic period, you have Jews from Savannah among the very first elected officials, Jewish elected officials in the young nation. So we've got Savannah and Charleston, small pockets of Jewish life. There are Jews in Richmond as well, I believe, by the time of the Revolutionary War. And they start to form communities, right? So we've got here a picture of Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim. You know, a small but significant congregation and a small but significant Jewish community in the early Republic era. So Savannah, to the south of Charleston, had a peak of 70 Jews during the colonial era. In Charleston, there were 12 Jewish families in 1750 at the time of the founding of Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, often called KKBE. But that Charleston community grew fairly quickly after the American Revolution. So as late as 1820, Charleston actually boasted a larger Jewish community than New York City. So the painting we see here is evidence of that. This painting was done by Solomon Nunez Carvalho. He painted it from memory, actually. It represents the first synagogue built by Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, which was dedicated in 1794, but burned in 1838. So this is as it would have appeared when he was a young man. We can pick out a couple things from this picture. The exterior, not shown here, from what I've read, looks fairly church-like, reflects at least a level of acculturation or even assimilation among the Charleston Jews. The placement of the bima reflects the Sephardic majority in the Charleston community, as do some of the other architectural details. The two-story building with all this great natural light we see here, as well as sort of the arched roof, all reflect an affluent community that had done well for themselves, again, involved in sort of this Atlantic trade, which we know obviously involves the movement of enslaved people, the trade of enslaved people, as well as their labor. And we see sort of the Charleston Jews, as a component of that economy, and as having a level of wealth, right? That they could, this is, a nice looking building for the time. So that is sort of the earliest start of Jewish life in the South. It's a long history, and it's a history that the Jews in some of these really long-standing communities are fairly proud of and tell a lot. And it's a history that's available to folks who go on tours, in the sort of Carolina and Georgia corridor. So we're going to move now, though, to the mid-19th century, when we see larger numbers of Jews starting to show up across the United States as well as in the South. So we can look at the next slide. By this point, New York has sort of wildly surpassed the Jewish population in the South, but we do still have Jewish immigrants arriving in the region, and they come primarily as peddlers. So this is Isaac Wolf Bernheim. He came to Kentucky from Baden in the late 1860s, and really from the late 1840s on, you saw German-speaking migrants like Isaac Wolf Bernheim coming over. Oftentimes, the first ones to arrive were young single men. You can see he looks quite young in this picture, and they generally start out as peddlers. Unless they have family who have an established store, and even in that case, oftentimes they're taking a pack or multiple packs, filling them with wares, and setting out on foot to hawk what they've, hawk their goods to in the surrounding countryside. Bernheim here actually ended up owning a bourbon company. Jews like Bernheim were important in the South prior to the Civil War, but become indispensable in the years after the Civil War, when you see really the growth of sort of what we would think of as a modern market economy, especially in some of the smaller towns and cities in the interior South. And the trajectory for a successful Jewish peddler would be to start as a peddler, eventually work their way up to buying a cart, eventually perhaps see a young town that seemed promising to them, usually because of its location on a river or on a rail line. And from there, if they started a business, if that business lasted, and if they became successful enough, they might also find their way into local civic leadership. Nora, I believe our next picture is Herman Gladowsky. So here we see Herman Gladowsky. He was a 4-term Tampa mayor, elected in 1886. We can debate, of course, the southernness of Florida, but the Florida Gulf Coast in the late 19th century, I assure you, was very southern in a number of ways, including the sort of likelihood of tropical disease and the relative lack of infrastructure. So Gladowsky was elected to 4 non-consecutive terms. He's the only person to do that in Tampa history in the 1880s and 1890s. He had lived in New York and then in Gainesville prior to that, but he was born in Germany in 1843. And he's a good example of a merchant. He owned a men's clothing store, who found his way, into the local elite and really became tightly integrated into, civic leadership in his place. And we can see, in some ways he's exceptional, right? We need to keep our eye on all those peddlers who never really found a place to land, or all those merchants who had, multiple failures, or didn't make it in a place and moved on to the next town, or maybe moved back to New York City, or just ended up working for a relative, right? There are stories of failure as well as our Herman Gladowskys, but there's also a fair number of these late 19th century and some early 20th century Jewish immigrants or native-born Jews who become really important figures in the early histories of their towns and cities. So that story of success, as well as the settlement patterns that we see among Jews in this era, are really closely tied to the general sort of economic stories of these towns, right? There was a sense, and I think that this newspaper ad which says "big stock, new goods, don't forget that the Jews are in it," etc. This is a testament to the way that Jewish settlement was seen in many cases as a sign that a town was on an upward trajectory. Right? It was a sign of a certain level of cosmopolitanism. It was a sign of, that a town was going to be successful if these Jewish entrepreneurs had chosen to make a place for themselves there. So first, we see the settlement patterns follow the riverways that really allow for trade in the region, right? It's no coincidence that the first Jewish congregation in Mississippi is founded in Natchez, right, which is right on the Mississippi River, and Nora is going to be taking you there next week. That's no coincidence. Later on, the paths of rail lines really become a determinant of where we see Jewish communities popping up. Oftentimes that means a few Jewish stores, then many times a Jewish cemetery, preceding a synagogue or a congregation. Then a congregation, they build their own synagogue at some point, and then if the town gets large enough, you see multiple congregations and sort of this whole sort of ecosystem of Jewish institutions developing. But first, those are on rivers. First they're on the coast, then we see them on rivers. Later, we see them along the railways of the South, so that you see the development of, say, Jewish life in Clarksdale, Mississippi, really sort of gets going at the time that you see the railroad coming through, right? That's in the Mississippi Delta, where we see rail lines coming through in the 1880s. And it has to do with these agricultural economies. So if a place was producing well, we start to see this whole sort of economic life that attracts Jewish settlers. And as there are problems with the agricultural economy, or as the labor force associated with that agricultural economy starts to decline, we also start to see decline in Jewish communities. So in Natchez, Mississippi, they built their synagogue, the one that's still there, in, I believe, 1904. Is that the correct year, Nora? Close to there.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, 1904. They built it, I believe, for 200 people to be in the sanctuary, and never actually reached that number, because they built that synagogue right at the peak of their local congregation. Transportation changes, a number of other changes, and then the boll weevil later on all sort of lead to a decline there. In many towns in the South, that peak comes somewhat later. So in the Delta towns, you see that peak coming, say, in the 1930s or so, with a slow decline that really becomes evident and visible by the 1970s. At the same time, we see this decline in small towns, which again has to do with agricultural economy. So things like the automation of cotton picking, sort of the local topsoil being worn out, a variety of other, conditions, right, lead Jewish stores not to do quite as well, along with sort of pull factors, right? All the reasons that Jews might want to actually just move to a larger city to pursue a different line of work or be in a larger Jewish community. So you see a decline that's really visible by the 1970s and 1980s. In these small towns, you see a decline of Jewish retail, especially with the encroachment of big box stores and then now online retail. And a number of our small communities have actually closed, right? There are no longer synagogues there. At the same time, though, there are places where Jewish populations are rising, and sometimes really quickly. So you see massive Jewish growth in Atlanta between 1980 and, say, 2010. I think in several of those decades, the Jewish population actually doubled. You see really significant Jewish growth in Houston. In Atlanta, Jewish growth actually exceeds sort of the rate of general population growth. In Houston, it basically keeps pace. And then also in some of our mid-sized cities, you see Jewish growth. That could be Nashville, Austin, Jacksonville, Florida. You know, some of these sort of Sunbelt, what we might think of as sort of Sunbelt sort of boom cities. And more recently, that's been driven by government jobs, by the healthcare sector, and by higher education. So, we should go to our next picture. So this is a really good example of this. Binet Abraham Synagogue was built in Brenham, Texas in 1893. I believe it's an interesting example of Carpenter Gothic architecture, but I think basically they ordered this as sort of like they ordered all the pieces and then put it together where it was. A lot of churches look a lot like this. There was an Orthodox congregation there for several decades. That congregation had been essentially inactive for several decades by the time that I visited there around 2010. Brennan's Jewish population had dwindled to just a handful of people. And then we can go to the next slide. That synagogue was actually disassembled, put onto trucks, and then reassembled on the Shalom Austin campus there in Austin, right? A reflection of the way that one city is booming as another city has essentially lost most of its Jewish population. The B'nai Abraham Synagogue is now, I believe, the home to a small Orthodox congregation. So why might this all matter? First, Jewish history in the South changes our view of the South, both I'd say its past, its present, and potentially its future. It challenges this idea that sort of the white South is ethnically homogenous. And instead, when we look closely at Jews and other immigrant groups, we see some interesting diversity among sort of the white residents of the South. Now, that doesn't refute the primacy of a white-black divide being really a determining factor in the way that history has unrolled in the South, but it might help us understand it better. Understanding the nuances of sort of difference and belonging within the white community in the South is going to help us understand how race has worked in the South, how it's affected the development of the region, and how it continues to be an ongoing challenge, right, as we try to confront anti-Black racism. Secondly, this matters because it changes our view of American Jewish history, and I think to some degree also global Jewish history. So major movements in Jewish life, whether that's national movements or international movements, oftentimes actually have really interesting iterations in the South. And we see that not all of the action of American Jewish history takes place in New York City, that we can actually see innovation and creativity and perseverance in the South, as well as sort of stories of acculturation or assimilation that we might expect. And then lastly, and I've mentioned race a little bit, the South gives us, I think, important case studies in questions about the relationships between white, European descended Jews and whiteness in the United States, because we have these stark examples of racial disparity in enslavement, and then with Jim Crow segregation, seeing the ways that Jews respond to that, the way that Jews get swept up in sort of the politics of whiteness, whether they want to or not, can help us think, I think, more clearly about Jews and whiteness in a general case. So my time's about up. I want to take one example from my own research and just go through it and talk about why I think it matters. So I wrote a dissertation, as Nora mentioned, on the Arbiter Ring in the South, on the Workmen's Circle in the South, right? This is a national, really transnational organization, because there were Canadian branches, that finds its way down to the South beginning in about 1908, when there are branches founded in Dallas and in Atlanta. And it's sort of this southern extension of a transnational Jewish cultural and political movement, right? You have Jewish immigrants who came of age in Tsarist Russia, oftentimes developed anti-Tsarist or radical politics, had a commitment to secular Yiddish literature, secular Yiddish theater, in this whole sort of Yiddish world that was happening, but they find themselves in southern cities. In southern cities, they organize themselves. They have some political activity. They have a lot of cultural activity. They bring in lecturers and authors. They bring in singers. Sometimes they put on their own theater productions, all in Yiddish. And eventually they start Yiddish schools for their children. This is the Andrus family in Dallas, Texas. Chaya Rochel Andrus, the mother of this family, ended up writing poetry. She was publishing Yiddish poetry books in the 1960s and 1970s. And these stories, so they demonstrate this vibrancy, this unexpected diversity of Southern Jewish life. They also give us ways, places to think about this intersection of left-wing Jewish politics with Southern systems of race and racism. And it's a perfect place to think about, about race, racism, whiteness, and sort of the political economics of those things in the development of US Jewish history. So I'm happy to talk more about the Arbiter Ring or really any of these other topics. I'm available to visit your community, whether that's a synagogue or some other sort of group as a presenter, and I can do that online. And at some point in the future, I hope to be able to do that in person. And we also have available for you the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. This is a free online source. You can go to the ISJL website and find it there. It covers 13 states, and these are local histories of Jewish life in about 300 communities, right, from Texas to Virginia and down to Florida, that are really designed to give you a brief but substantive picture of how sort of a Jewish community developed in that place, and how it interacted with the broader story of that place. So if you're in one of these communities, if you're from one of these communities, if you have a strong attachment to one of these communities, I'd really, encourage you to go check out the encyclopedia, browse around a little bit. And if you have sort of questions or comments, feel free to be in touch. It's always good to hear from people who know about these communities firsthand. I think that's what I've got for today. I know Nora has a couple of questions. Hopefully we can get some questions going in the chat. And I look forward to continuing this.
Thank you so much, Josh. This is terrific. And I have some questions for you. Again, I want to encourage folks who are watching. I know we have a whole bunch of folks watching, that if you have questions for Josh, please put them in the comments, and we will get to them in this Q&A, because we really want to answer all of your questions. So Josh, I'm wondering, you mentioned your work with the Encyclopedia. What are some of the lessons you've learned from editing and developing new content for the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities?
As I work on the Encyclopedia, I'm struck by the ways that a lot of towns follow similar patterns, as well as by the exciting ways that places deviate, right? So you've got, sort of that like merchant class, small town, trade hub story that is Clarksdale, Mississippi, or Blytheville, Arkansas, or Brenham, Texas. You do have some fun outliers like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was really first the Jewish community there developed as part of that city's secret nuclear facility around the end of World War II. So that's like an exciting, fun one. Cape Canaveral area similarly has this influx of post-World War II Jewish scientists that makes it a little different story. So it's always fun to sort of both to see the big patterns and to see sort of the exciting outliers. The big challenge that I contend with, and this is what I think about this a lot, is how to tell the Jewish story in a way that does justice to the general story and that balances sort of the specificity of the Jewish experience with the overall context. So I just did updates for Clarksdale, Mississippi. In the Mississippi Delta, which is majority Black and which has been described as sort of the most Southern place on earth, we really have to be paying attention to African American history as we're writing this, because it's so much a determinant of what Jews find there, and what's maybe what might be one of the most important things about Jewish life in the Delta, as well as in some other parts of the South, right, is sort of how Jews react to and are involved in this overarching story, right, of enslavement, of segregation, and of the struggles against it. Let's see. Yeah, so those are some of the big things I thought about. I should add also that trying to do a little more to nod to Indigenous history where we see Jewish history sort of rubbing up against it, because there are some really interesting examples there. But, I learn over and over about, all these sort of interesting places. And it's definitely improved my geography. So.
Awesome, thank you. So we have some questions in the comments. I am just scrolling to find them. So our first question is from Marianne. She asks, were Jews who immigrated from Germany peddlers or merchants already, or did they have various other careers when they were in Germany?
Yeah, that depends. A lot of them did sort of have that, the sort of classic story of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe is that they occupy sort of these middleman positions, oftentimes sort of trading and occupying a position sort of between, say, agricultural workers or local peasants and nobility. That's definitely the story in Poland and some other parts of Eastern Europe. A lot of times, yes, they did come from sort of a trade background, which made trading in these environments easier. And you do hear stories like, for example, that, it's a common sort of family story to say, oh, my, great whatever grandfather came from Alsace and he liked this part of the world because, the rolling countryside reminded him of where he was from. But oftentimes there's some sort of precedence for Jews having been involved in some sort of trading occupation prior. Not in all cases. You do have Jews who were landowners or farmers or, had worked in industry or whatever. But oftentimes there is precedent.
Awesome. That's really helpful. Thank you. We have another question from Harry, who is in Clarksdale. And Harry's wondering, do you see significance in the importance of the county seat as a settling place?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think that's actually a really good point, that in many of these cases, the towns we're talking about are county seats, right? So Clarksdale is the seat of Coahoma County, and becomes the place where you see a synagogue in that part of the Delta. Now, the first Jews in that part of the world weren't in Clarksdale, right? As far as I know, the first Jews there settled in Friars Point, or Friar Point, correct me if I'm wrong, which is sort of northwest, which started first because it was right on the river. Well, as you know, the Mississippi River, especially in the 19th century, is very flood prone. And then as the rail comes through and is built a little bit off the river, right, Clarksdale becomes the prime location and becomes the real sort of hub for the area. And of course, then the county seat as well. So you definitely see oftentimes, say if you've got a county and there's one synagogue, oftentimes, yes, it is in the county seat, which is sort of the largest trading hub. And if you look at a map of the South, right, these little trading hubs are spread really evenly. They're about a day's travel from each other, or something like that. And then, you get 5 of those, and you get a big city or something like that. Is sort of the pattern. So definitely, yeah, those patterns matter and do sort of shape where we see these clusters.
Awesome. Harry also has a follow-up question about what were the Clarksdale Encyclopedia updates?
So the Clarksdale Encyclopedia updates, first of all, some new images. And there's one I'm going to add. So I should give some credit to Marjorie Kirstein, who's done a lot of work on Jewish history in Clarksdale. So I've got newer, larger pictures. The internet's a different place than when we started the encyclopedia over 10 years ago, 15 years ago almost, I think. And we want higher resolution, larger pictures. So, I'm about to add one of Adolf Kirstein, who was one of the very first known Jews in the area that Marjorie Kirstein, a descendant of his, shared with me. So one thing is larger pictures. Another thing is just updates. So that, say, in Clarksdale, I mentioned that there is still a young Jewish family in Clarksdale whose kids, I believe, attend religious school in Greenville. In some other towns, it's updating that, this synagogue is closed or this store has closed. In some places, there's a new synagogue, right, in our growing cities. Let's see what some of the other Clarksdale ones were. I wanted to do a little better job of talking about race in Clarksdale, so I shaped it to focus a little more on that. I changed a little bit of the way that we described Benjamin Schultz. Also in Mississippi, this is sort of behind the scenes, but we originally were doing like the local Jewish history on one page and then a separate page for like the synagogue. And I've combined those because there's only a couple of states where we had that separate structure. And I found it a little cumbersome. So I've actually combined those. So it's just one essay now. And there was a little bit of trimming down that happened while I did that, but I don't think that there's been a bunch left out. And the good news for Clarksdale is there are other sources, right? In part, again, because of the work of Marjorie Kirstein, you can find some of her stuff online. So there's other stuff about Clarksdale. So I felt okay getting a little more condensed in order to provide something that was streamlined and maybe a little easier to use.
Thanks, Josh. We have a question from a wonderful colleague, Josh Furman, who says hi from Houston.
Oh, hey, Josh.
He says, as we wait for Hurricane Laura to make landfall, as we wait for Hurricane Laura to make landfall, I've got natural disasters and climate change on my mind. Where do you see those topics fitting in with Southern Jewish history?
So Galveston, of course, and I'm not going to, so Dr. Furman is at this point sort of the guy for Jewish Houston. I'm not going to, I would leave it up to somebody else to talk a little more about hurricanes there. But, we do know that, of course, the 1900 hurricane in Galveston, what's the year on that? But, Galveston, was basically wiped out or close to wiped out by this massive hurricane right in the early 20th century that really sets the stage for Houston to surpass it as the center of Jewish life in that part of Texas. So certainly we see past natural disasters having major effects on some of our Jewish communities. So I know we can talk about the Texas coast. Katrina, obviously significantly affected Jewish life in New Orleans. There are actually a series of oral history interviews called Katrina's Jewish Voices that we were lucky enough to help gather in conjunction with the Jewish Women's Archive. So there is a real archive, a strong archive there on that. Beyond natural disaster, disease does affect these communities. So I mentioned, part of the reason Tampa didn't develop quicker was that, you'd have yellow fever or other tropical diseases coming through every few years. And that was really an impediment to the development of Jewish settlement in Florida below, say, Ocala, until the late 19th century. Similarly, you see, yellow fever and other diseases playing a role in the Jewish history of New Orleans. So, and other cities, right? So Biloxi Gulfport, which I recently updated, the first sign of Jewish life in Biloxi Gulfport is the establishment of a cemetery in, I want to say the 1870s or so. But, that cemetery was actually founded by Jews who had fled New Orleans to try to avoid disease. Some of them brought it with them and then died there in Biloxi Gulfport. And it seems like that original Jewish cemetery in Biloxi was in some ways sort of a satellite of a Jewish burial society in New Orleans. Was sort of the impression that I got looking at the resources. So I think there are some other examples that we could think of, but certainly these things play a role. They'll probably continue to play a role. I didn't do a lot of speculating, but as I was writing the Florida Encyclopedia, it was tempted. I don't know if I ever did this. I was very tempted to write, and we'll see what happens. Like, we'll see what happens in South Florida because there are changes on the way, right? So,
thanks, Josh. We have a question from Bob. Bob is wondering if the presence of the ISJL in Jackson has had a noticeable impact on the Jewish community there.
Well, yeah. If you look at our if you go to the synagogue on a Wednesday afternoon during Hebrew school, you see that there are a number of teachers, right? Our education fellows who come here for 2 years are often involved in one way or another with the synagogue, whether that's sort of Tikkun Olam committee, whether that's religious school instruction. And then, of course, you've got the Jewish professionals who move here more permanently for the ISJL, and that includes fellows who have stayed. So if you look at, say, my son's religious school class, there's 2 kids of a relatively small number, either have parents who work at the ISJL or parents who first came to Jackson as education fellows. So yes, I would say that there's definitely a footprint there. It's not like we're not the ones keeping the congregation alive. There's other folks, but it's a real presence, and it's a good relationship.
So I have one more question for you. And again, I'll encourage folks who are watching that if you have additional questions, feel free to put them in the comments or sort of respond to our weekly emails, and we'll try to sort of answer some of those in future sessions and sort of do what we can. But I'm wondering, Josh, what's one thing that you wish everyone knew about the history of Jews in the South?
Yeah, to me, what's really important is the plurality of Jewish stories. I think there's maybe the predominant story, if we're looking late 19th to mid 20th century, is a story about Jewish merchants who come and start communities that end up being Reform communities. Right? I mentioned sort of the South as a stronghold of Reform Judaism, that are very acculturated, that occupy buildings that might look somewhat church-like, that might have large organs, as we see in Natchez, Mississippi. And that's a story that might be in some ways the dominant story, at least especially with small and mid-sized towns through the 20th century. But there's all these other stories. There are of course Sephardic communities in Atlanta and in Montgomery that have their own fascinating traditions and stories. There are Orthodox communities, sure, in our big cities, but also some folks who really stick to some version of Orthodoxy in some of our smaller towns, right? Whether that's Greenwood or Brenham, Texas, Greenwood, Mississippi, that is. And then, with the Arbiter Ring, with my personal sort of, project, right? We see these folks who really tenaciously cling to Yiddish and secular Yiddish culture in these places that we really wouldn't expect. And that includes Houston and Atlanta, but that includes Macon, Georgia, and Waco, Texas, right? Not exactly hotbeds of radicalism or of secular Yiddishkeit, but they were there. So it's really that diversity of experiences. I'd say the last one to include there is if we look at South Texas and the really fascinating, Spanish-speaking Jewish populations that you see in some of those towns, is another really interesting Southern or perhaps Southwestern Jewish story from the region. So again, it's that diversity, that wide variety of stories that I think really is what I would like people to understand, even as they sort of gain appreciation for maybe some of the more common arc. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Josh. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen momentarily.
Thank you.
Here.
This is really fun.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your great questions. We're so excited to answer them and continue answering them. And thank you all again so much for joining for this first session of the virtual vacation, whether you are watching it right now on Facebook Live or checking it out later on our website. We're really continuing to experiment and develop this program, so we welcome your questions and suggestions and ideas as we move forward. This is just session one. Next week, I'm very excited. We're going to be diving into the history of Natchez, Mississippi. As Josh mentioned, Natchez is home to the oldest Jewish community in the state. And we're going to meet some of the people who interpret and preserve and share that history and think about how Jews have made homes for themselves in the South, including in Natchez. I've been having some great conversations with colleagues in Natchez, including the executive director of the Historic Natchez Foundation, the executive director of the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians, as well as the director of Cultural Heritage Tourism for Visit Natchez, and the executive director emeritus of the Natchez Museum of African American History and Culture. So that's sure to be a really, really great session. Again, please sign up at the link in the comments to make sure that you're getting emails about this program. And please share this with your friends. Unlike a normal tour group, our digital tour group has no size limit. So we welcome all. So thank you again so much. We'll see you on Tuesday, September 1st at 11 a.m. Central Time, right here on the ISJL Facebook page or later on the Virtual Vacation website. Thank you again so much and take care.